Um, my name is Edward Schumacher de Matos, and I'm the director of the Edward R. Murrow Center for Digital World at the Fletcher School, a graduate school of global affairs in Tufts University. I welcome you to the third in the series of sessions we're doing in key regions around the world on what the U.S. needs to do to rebuild its public diplomacy and influence or soft power. The purpose is to lead to a report and recommendations that we will submit to the next president of Congress. The Russia and Eurasia program at Fletcher is collaborating with us on this particular session, and we're delighted to have them here with us. But we're especially delighted now to have speaking one of the wisest and most respected experts on foreign policy in Russia and on U.S.-Russian relations, Andrei Kortunov. Dr. Kortunov is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He was trained as an historian and as a diplomat in embassies in Washington and London and the UN before joining the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies. In 2011, he became director of the independent Russian International Affairs Council. He's lectured around the world. Dr. Tarlow will be engaged by Dr. Elizabeth Tarlow. Dr. Tarlow is herself an expert on Russia and Russian foreign policy. She earned her PhD at Fletcher and was for many years the associate director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. She holds the prestigious position today of chair of the Fletcher Board of Advisors. Dr. Tarlow will engage Dr. Kortunov for about 40 or 45 minutes on today's subject, which is the U.S. in the eyes of Russians, model, possible friend, or forever foe. Afterwards, Dr. Tarlow will open the floor to your questions. If you will submit them via the chat box during the interview, Eric Burakovsky will pick as many as he can and read them. I now turn the program over to Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm especially delighted to be talking to Andrei, my dear friend Andrei, who I have to just say, coincidentally, I first met in 1985 in Hokkaido, Japan. We were taking part in the inaugural summer session of the Fletcher School's North Pacific program, which was developed and directed by dear John Perry, professor who is now retired, who endeavored to bring together people from the North Pacific Rim to engage in conversations about political, economic, intellectual, cultural trends of the countries. And it was barely 4 months into Gorbachev's leadership. Perestroika and glasnost hadn't even been articulated. And we were shocked, we Fletcher students were absolutely shocked that there were representatives from the Soviet Union. And it was clear that Andrei, who I believe at that time was already working at the Institute of US and Canadian Studies, was already a keen observer of the United States and going places. So it's no surprise. Hi, Andrei.
Hi there.
So today, we're going to be talking about perceptions. And I just wanted to start, Andrei, by just mentioning, of course, so many experts now describe US-Russian relations as reminiscent of the Cold War and with its plethora of highly charged issues. Gosh, we know everything from the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, relations with Iran, American economic sanctions, Russian counter-sanctions, spy scandals, the theft of COVID-19 research, accusations of Russian meddling in elections, and it goes on both sides. So as we launch into a discussion of Russian perceptions of the United States and of Americans in general, how do we distinguish between perceptions of the Russian government, the Russian elites, and the Russian people in general? And are these differences important in terms of Russian decision-making?
Well, first of all, Liz, let me say that it's very nice to see you after all these years. And I still remember our great days at the University of Hokkaido in Sapporo. Of course, Professor Perry was really a mastermind who created his own universe. And let me also say that it's nice to be back to Fletcher. It's a great school. You have some great scholars. You have a great dean. And I would definitely like to be there in person, but at least I can enjoy a conversation with some of Fletcher students and faculty. Now, getting back to your question, I should probably make one footnote. I'm biased because I spent a large part, I would even argue the best part of my professional life studying the United States. That's why, of course, maybe in certain ways, my opinions are not completely impartial, and that might color my understanding of how Russians think of Americans, and I might be slightly biased in favor of this country. But let me say that indeed the gap between the political elites, to the extent you can talk about political elites in Russia, because my personal view is that we do not have elites in the classical Weberian sense of the word. We have state apparatus, we have bureaucracies, we have people close to the current leadership, but I'm not sure that they can really qualify as classical European elites. I think that they do not have a couple of important characteristics of this group. But anyway, I think that there is clearly a gap between the political establishment, let me put it in this way, and ordinary people. And also sociological data suggest that the level of anti-Americanism is much higher at the top than at the bottom. And there are various explanations why it is the case. One of explanations, which is basically apparent, is that people in the street do not care. They do not care about foreign countries. They do not know much about the United States. So why should they have negative feelings about this country? Another explanation is that for the political establishment, anti-Americanism is a part of their legitimacy. It's an important source of their legitimacy. You need to have an enemy in order to justify some of your actions, maybe to justify some of mistakes that you make. And you mentioned perestroika. I always believed that the Soviet Union fell apart not because of the arms race, not because of the Star Wars, but because at some point it was deprived of an enemy. And the Soviet elites at that point started to lose their legitimacy. And I think that might explain why the contemporary generation of the Russian political establishment tends to be anti-American. We should also keep in mind that when Soviet and Russian establishments wanted to compare themselves with another country, the United States is a usual suspect. It's the yardstick. Russians, at least Russian politicians, tend to take a rather condescending approach to Europe. I think they do not consider China as a kind of real adversary or competitor, but the United States stands out as a traditional arch adversary or even enemy. So I think that there are some instincts, if you wish, genetic memory. And people of the Putin's generation got socialized in the Soviet Union. And I think that they might still remember the days of the Cold War, and they feel rather comfortable in this environment. I do not want to say that we are entering a new Cold War. I don't think it will happen for a variety of reasons. But I think that there is some natural feeling about the United States within the leadership. And let me repeat, they feel comfortable about having the United States as the opponent.
So interesting. They feel comfortable. Do they actually perceive the United States as a declining or rising in terms of its influence these days, in terms of its hard power, its military strength, as well as its alliances and its economic power? I mean, does American soft power or hard power even matter to Russia, or which one matters more?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think that here we see a kind of schizophrenic attitude. On the one hand, if you follow the official propaganda, of course, the topic of an American decline is there. And if you watch the Russian TV, of course, they show pictures of the current problems in the United States, including these summer racial problems and also the apparent inability of the United States to deal with the COVID pandemic. So basically, they would like to emphasize the U.S. decline. That fits into their picture of the world. But on the other hand, and this is where I see sort of schizophrenia. On the other hand, if you follow this propaganda, you'll find that Americans are everywhere. Americans are in Belarus trying to overthrow Lukashenko. Americans are in Khabarovsk trying to instigate street activities and anti-Putin activities. Americans are in the Middle East. So it seems that the United States is perceived on the one hand as a weak country, as a declining power, but also as an omnipotent power, which is present everywhere with the sole goal of hurting Russia. When I was a student, we had a joke. And then it was the Soviet Union, of course, not Russia. But the joke was that the United States interferes into the domestic affairs of the Soviet Union all over the world. And I think that this is something which is back, because whatever the United States is doing, let's say, take India, of course, the perception which the official propaganda is trying to project is that the United States works with India specifically to break down these traditional good relations between Delhi and Moscow. That's why the United States wants to destroy the current cooperation between the two countries, including the cooperation in the military technical field. And this is something that demonstrates that the United States is also obsessed with Russia and cannot take the fact that Russia is becoming a stronger player in the international relations.
So does Russia even believe that the United States understands Russia's national interests? And for example, does it understand its perceptions of its near abroad, its sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space? Or does Moscow feel that the United States either doesn't understand it or is condescending toward it, or perhaps even a little bit hypocritical about it?
Well, I think that there is a profound feeling that the United States either does not understand or does not care. Because if you follow the discourse, many Russian actions, which the United States perceives as revisionism, in Moscow are perceived as defensive actions. Even if you take Ukraine, which in the West is clearly associated with very aggressive actions by Putin and by his team. If you talk to people around Putin, they would tell you that that was not our intention to break down the status quo in Ukraine. We didn't really want to take the Crimea. We didn't want to start this civil war in Donbass. It is exactly because the West and the United States in particular interfered into Ukraine because the United States disrupted this very delicate balance between pro-Russian and pro-European forces in Ukraine. We were forced to interfere just to protect our compatriots, to protect people who belong to the Russian cultural civilizational space. So whatever is interpreted in the United States as a clear manifestation of the Russian imperialism. In Russia, at least in the Kremlin, is interpreted as a kind of legitimate defensive status quo focused foreign policy. And Putin was very clear about that. He said, you know, Russia is like a bear. You know, the bear will not find very attractive to go to jungles or to a desert, but the bear will defend his taiga. And please do not get here. This is our space, and we will protect it, and we will do whatever is needed to protect it. So I think that you can, of course, question this narrative. You can say that there is hypocrisy here, but my take is that definitely the Russian leadership considers the US foreign policy to be also quite hypocritical on many accounts, ranging from how the United States defines its vital interests to how the United States uses human rights as a foreign policy tool.
Makes sense. Thank you. And turning now, I can't emphasize, of course, we are all obsessed with domestic politics here in the United States, just coming off of the last presidential debate last night. I want to ask you a question about US domestic political messaging on international affairs, and does it help or hurt its image in Russia? And how is US political polarization, does all this fragmentation of the news media and partisan conflict play out? How is it perceived in Russia?
Again, it depends on whom you're talking to. I think that many ordinary people in Russia feel sympathetic to the problems that the United States goes through. Of course, many of these problems came as a surprise. For example, you know, I already mentioned the pandemic. I think that if you talk to ordinary Russians, they would say, you know, it's unbelievable. You know, the United States with its great medicine, we thought that they were the best. They spend so much money, they have all these hospitals, and how could they have failed in such an apparent way? How could have they lost this competition to China? You know, that something is wrong about that. So I think that there is a degree of what I would say demystification of the United States, which is not necessarily bad, because it turns out in the end of the day that Americans are people like us. They have their own problems. They're not always successful. They make mistakes. So, you know, the United States probably has now a little bit more of human touch. But of course, you know, if you take the Kremlin, if you take the Russian leadership, they interpret, you know, these domestic problems as a sign of weakness. And their point is that if Americans cannot put their house in order, we cannot really deal with them because they cannot deliver on what their leaders might promise. That's why, you know, when they ask me about Trump, I think that Putin might like Trump personally because there are many commonalities in their views of the world, of the international system. They are both nationalistic, they are both unilateralists, they are both transactionalists, but at the same time, I'm not sure that President Putin really respects Trump because Trump might make a statement and then, like it was in case of the first and the last summit meeting in Helsinki, they had apparently agreed on something. Then Trump went back home and he confronted a hostile Congress and the opposition within the deep state. And ultimately, the net result of this summit meeting was a flood of sanctions against Russia. So I think that for Putin, it is easier to deal with people like Xi Jinping in China, or even with Erdogan in Turkey, because these are strong people who will deliver if they promise something. And I don't think that there is an understanding of how the US political system operates. And there is no appreciation, at least my feeling, is that in the Russian leadership, there is no real appreciation of the checks and balances system. That this ambiguity is the price that you have to pay for keeping democracy in the United States.
You know, following along on that, so Putin actually recently had an interview with Russia TV, in which, not surprisingly, he said, of course, he could work with either candidate who became the future president. And we all know that traditionally, it's been more of our hardliner, more anti-Russian, anti-Soviet leaders who have actually gotten quite a bit done, whether it was Nixon or Reagan, in terms of relations. In this country, Trump is perceived as soft on Russia, obviously, and with Biden representing a harder line. So on the other hand, I'm wondering if is there a real perception that Putin could make progress, that Russia and the United States actually could make some progress? For instance, on the START treaty, we know that it's about to expire next year. There's been some discussion about that. Would that be a concrete measure to work on to actually, let's say, I don't think it would happen under Trump, but let's say Biden were the next president. Could you envision that being the beginning of some kind of improvement of relations?
Well, I'm sure that Putin personally and his team would like to have a deal with the United States. Arms control stands out as arguably the most important area for potential cooperation, but I also believe that they would like to work with Americans on other issues. For example, on Middle East, or they would like probably to expand this cooperation on the Arctic region. However, the point is that they're not willing to pay for it, because the perception is that if they make unilateral concessions, if they go first, then the US side will interpret it as a sign of weakness, and it will keep pushing Russia even harder. So I think that what we have in Moscow, or at least, this picture behind my back in the Kremlin, I think that there is a sense of doom that basically we tried everything. We made proposals, we tried to reach out to Americans, we tried to be nice, we tried to be flexible, but basically it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and there is not much else that we can do, unless we're ready to capitulate, which we are not ready to do. So I think that the perception, and probably it's a wrong perception, but still the perception is that Russia has already depleted its reservoir of proposals and manifestations of goodwill. So the conclusion that they make is that it doesn't really matter what we have to propose, because they simply don't like us. We thought that they didn't like us because we were communists, but it turns out that they don't like us because we're Russians. And it's probably something genetic about Americans. Maybe Russia is simply a very convenient for Americans. It's nice to have such an enemy because it's not China. If you want to have a real clash with China, you have to pay a lot of money for that. Russia is an affordable enemy, and this is an enemy that consolidates the US society, at least the US political establishment, and there is nothing we can do about that. So I think that this is one of the problems. Expectations are low, and from this viewpoint, Russia is one of, when I say Russia, I mean, of course, the Russian leadership. Russia is one of very few countries for which it doesn't really matter who is going to win. Because if Trump wins, it most likely will see another 4 bumpy years with no results. If Biden wins, we will probably see even harder approach towards Russia. So I think that right now, expectations are quite low. It doesn't mean that they will do nothing trying to improve the relationship, but I think that if you compare the situation today to the situation in November of 2016, when Trump came to power, expectations are much lower right now than they were 4 years ago.
So let's kind of keep on that theme a little bit, but shift more onto the concept of political values. You probably read a recent working group paper by Henry Hale and Olga Kamenchuk that was based on survey work they had done in 2019. And actually they identified American perceptions toward Russia as more negative than vice versa. And they pinpointed it based on domestic politics and the domestic political system, I should say, where Russian perceptions, I think, are more focused on American foreign policy. But along those lines, how do Russians compare their system of government, their concept of civil society, and those of the United States, and are indeed today Russians more attracted to autocratic values or to democratic values, or is that way too broad a question and you really can't give it an answer?
Well, of course, it's a very general question. And also, we should keep in mind that the Russian society is a moving target. We used to have the so-called Crimea consensus. Mm-hmm. Before that, we had another consensus. I think that for Russians, the ideas of democracy are to a large extent compromised by 1990s. Mm-hmm. Because we had anarchy there, a lot of hardships, a lot of crimes. So unfortunately, democracy is associated with this period. Also, I should probably add that if you look at countries around Russia that have chosen this, democratic path of development, there are not too many success stories. Well, you can say that democracy probably works in Baltic states, though, of course, a person from the Kremlin would immediately remark that it's not really democracy when they treat national minorities the way they do. So it's a crippled democracy in its own sense. But if you take other countries which are closer to Russia, like Ukraine, unfortunately, the track record of Ukraine in terms of social and economic development is not impressive, to say the least. So Putin say, well, you want democracy? Do you want to see Russia become a larger Ukraine? Probably not. That's why authoritarianism has certain appeal. However, I think that there is a nuance here, because when they talk about authoritarianism, they imply efficient authoritarianism. For example, you take China, and I mentioned already how China managed the COVID pandemic. I think it is interpreted by many Russians as a case of very efficient authoritarian system, which can deliver, which can meet public expectations. So many would say that they wouldn't mind to have an authoritarian system in Russia, provided that this system is fair and efficient. And let me end with saying that I think it's about justice rather than about democracy. And when people are critical of Putin, it's not necessarily because he's an autocrat, but because they believe that the system that he built is not just, it's not fair. And I think for Russians, not only for Russians, of course, but for Russians in particular, this concept of fairness, of justice is very important.
So pivoting a little bit toward cultural, educational and scientific areas, is the US culture still attractive to Russians? Certainly during the Soviet period, there was a sense that it was. Now, I think things are changing. I'm wondering if other cultures of other countries are looking more attractive.
Well, it's hard to tell, of course, because culture contains various dimensions. For example, Russians have always been techno geeks, if I might use this term. They have always had this admiration for technology. And from this viewpoint, they're not that different from Americans, because Americans also like new technologies and gadgets, things like that. But that means that, for example, Elon Musk is very popular in Russia. He shouldn't be popular because he's a peer competitor to Roscosmos, and he can take the space market away from Russians. But nevertheless, if you talk to ordinary people, they will say, well, he's a great guy. Steve Jobs is a great guy. He is a role model. And there are many people who really turn, these technocrats into role models. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is, of course, the US. I don't know whether we can really call that an American mass culture, but Hollywood, blockbusters. They are as popular in Russia as they are anywhere in the United States or in Europe. And definitely it has an impact. Though, again, I would venture to say that it's already a cosmopolitan phenomenon. You have European producers and actors from all over the world. It's a big industry, which is not exclusively American. But still, I think it is associated primarily with the United States. And I think that it still has a certain appeal. But to be fair, and not to be so optimistic about the United States, I have to confess that, of course, this unique position of the United States as a model society, as a model technological hub, as the country with best education, is gradually eroded. For example, 10 years ago, if you were to buy a smartphone, of course, iPhone was number one choice, no doubt. If you have money, if you can afford it, that's the best thing that the market can offer you. Today, it's not necessarily the case. They would say, well, of course, there are people who stick to iPhones, but there are people who would say, well, probably, Samsung, South Korean gadget is better. Maybe Huawei is better than iPhone. So I think that probably there is a change, and views are more diverse on what model is the best and what products are the best. So the United States is no longer the only game in town, if I might put it in this way. But still, just take personal decisions. If you are a young Russian and if you want to emigrate to another country, the odds are that you will not go to China. You might go to China to work, but if you want to settle down, it will be either Europe or the United States. So there is still some attraction, and the United States, in certain ways, can be regarded superior to Europe because it is easier to integrate. I go to France. I speak the language, but no one would consider me to be a Frenchman. You need to spend maybe 20 years, maybe 40 years a year to become accepted as a Frenchman. But in the United States, it is easier. The society is very tolerant, and I think this is perceived as a major advantage, not just over closed societies like Japanese society. We all know that it is impossible to become a Japanese, but even European societies, which are less open to foreigners and less tolerant. I think this is an important advantage of the United States. And another advantage that I should also mention, I think it is really appreciated by many Russians, is that in the United States, you always have a second chance. If you fail, or in Europe, if you fail, you fail. And that's it, the end of story. In Russia, I think with some exceptions, it's about the same. But in the United States, I think it's different. And again, this is a very attractive feature of the US society, of the US culture.
That's such an interesting point. Can I ask you, let's talk a little bit more about American higher education. And there was a time when it was extremely attractive, I think, for Russians to come and study here. As you know, Fletcher has a relationship with McGimo. We have a joint program, a joint course. What does it look like in the near future? Will Russians still find it attractive to come to the United States to study? I know the visas are a problem now, but even if they were doing it virtually, is it still seen as, you referenced that it's perceived as being, is not as top notch as it was in the past? What is the, how are they evaluating top universities here, for instance, and their ability to translate education that they might get here to jobs and advancement back home?
Well, I think that the US education is still very attractive. Of course, it is less affordable now than it was 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, there were many fellowships, there were many support programs, and of course, US universities were more open to accommodate Russian students. At some point, Russia was the flavor of the season, as you remember. So right now, it's gone. That's why if you don't have a lot of money, well, you know better than I do how much it costs to get good education in this country. Definitely, this is not easy. I think that American universities are attractive not only because of the skills that they can offer, but also as an instrument of socializing. You know, you get there, you get into a very vibrant, multicultural, cosmopolitan environment, and definitely this is something that you can profit from a lot if you want to. At the same time, again, I should probably also inject a grain of salt here. I can tell you that if you look at the university infrastructure, and if you compare top 10 schools in the United States and top 10 schools in China, I would say that, alas, but Chinese universities are better in terms of university buildings, in terms of libraries, in terms of students' dormitories, in terms of campuses. Of course, they invest a lot. And it's fascinating. You know, I never thought that I would see anything like that in a nation country, but some of their schools are great. And also, you know, you should not forget that in many Chinese universities, take Fudan in Shanghai, for example, most of the teaching takes place in English. So you don't need to study Chinese to get a decent education. But another important aspect is, of course, opportunities after you graduate. And I think that that might be pretty painful. If you have to get back home, the rules of the game are quite different in Russia compared to the United States. So a diploma from a good US university will not necessarily guarantee your employment opportunities, especially now, when there are suspicions you went there and you are a potential spy, you might be an agent of influence, you might be intoxicated by the US ideology. So unfortunately, the social status of US education is not as high as it was some 20 years ago, because the political cloud, of course, is there. Again, not in all the disciplines, but if you take especially social science and humanities, well, I'm not sure that these days, if you have a line in your CV reflecting your affiliation to a US university, that would help you to get a job in the Kremlin. I doubt it, frankly. But that's a relatively new phenomenon. We don't know whether it is a lasting phenomenon or not. But still, I have to say that the US education is still quite popular, not just in Russia, I think, all over the place.
Would you say that the top students are more likely to go to China or to Europe right now, because if they want, especially if they want jobs in the government?
Well, if they want jobs in government, they will stay at home.
Mhm.
There are a couple of schools, we all know them.
Foreign affairs, even foreign affairs?
Or foreign affairs in particular, because foreign affairs, you need to have a kind of impeccable CV. So foreign affairs, it should be either MGIMO or the High School of Economics or something like that, Moscow State University. If you work in business in the private sector, that's a different pair of shoes, because then you might really capitalize on your education in one of top US schools. In the private sector, definitely they do not have such prejudices about foreign education. But look, even in this new version of the Russian Constitution, there was one of the amendments was that you cannot get elected as a Russian president if you spent a long time abroad, and if you had something like a green card in a foreign country. So if you are really ambitious and you aim high, then definitely foreign education, not just the US education, but foreign education is not an asset, but rather a liability.
Mhm. All right, well, switching from soft power to sharp power, I'm sure you're familiar with the article that was in Foreign Affairs by National Endowment of Democracy, that they had coined this term sharp power, and it was used to describe aggressive and subversive policies used by authoritarian governments as a projection of state power in democratic countries. So it named Russian state-funded RT news network as an example of sharp power. And according to the National Endowment of Democracy, autocratic states, not quote, are not necessarily seeking to win hearts and minds, the common frame of reference for soft power efforts, but they're surely seeking to manipulate their target audiences by distorting the information that reaches them. So how, if at all, is this term understood among Russian elites? Does it resonate with them that as distinct from soft power and hard power, it is more descriptive of state-funded news? And do they project this onto other countries as well? In other words, I'm sure that they use certainly the party line that the United States manipulates a lot of information. But is this a term that they are even aware of, or let's say, concerned about in terms of their own image? And how is this discussed among the elites?
Well, I would question the term, because I don't see a sharp power. I see, rather basic, sometimes very linear, if not primitive, coverage of international events. It's not very sophisticated. I'm not sure that it is very efficient. I might be wrong, but when I see some of these channels, in my view, they are dumb. I cannot find a different word to label them. In my view, sharp power means that it should be really something very sophisticated, very efficient, very sharp. Like a sharp person. But I'm not sure that what they do in many media outlets can be qualified as sharp. So I would have certain reservations about that. I would rather say that the Russian foreign policy can be sharp compared to liberal democracies. If you take, for example, Syria, I think Russia definitely acted as a sharp power in the sense that with very limited resources, with very limited price paid in blood and treasure, Russia has managed to emerge from a very marginal play in the region into the main power broker in the Middle East. If you compare the Russian operation in Syria with the US operation in, let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan, definitely Russia has demonstrated more sharpness than the United States. And we can discuss why it happened, but I think that this is sharp power. If you take, this so-called interference into domestic affairs through social networks or through RT and other media outlets, my personal take is that the idea is not to somehow destroy the US democracy, but the roots of the Russian behavior are mostly pedagogical. Basically, they would like to teach Americans a lesson. You interfered into our affairs for so long with your media, with your foundations, with your NGOs, and you manipulated the Russian political developments to your liking. But folks, you should understand that you yourselves also live in the house of glass. And if you live in the house of glass, you should not throw stones at your neighbor's windows. So I think that they want to get equal. And that's why, for example, when Putin was interviewed by, I think it was by CNN a couple of years ago about, these hackers or bloggers or whoever they are, he took a very condescending attitude, very dismissive. Well, folks, that's your problem. You should fix it. It's not a big deal anyway. So I think that definitely in Russia, at least at the Russian leadership, maybe not among experts, but at the level of the leadership, there is no real understanding of the centrality of this issue for the United States and for other liberal democracies, that it is important. And I think this is a profound difference in political cultures. And that's why all attempts to agree on how to use or not to use this sharp power, all attempts to figure out how to cut a deal between Russia and the United States, all these attempts always fail. I do remember, when they were working on the Helsinki summit, John Bolton and Fiona Hill came to Moscow, and one of the ideas was to figure out whether Russia and the United States can sign an agreement on mutual non-interference into each other's domestic affairs. And of course, that failed because Putin can pick the line and call CEO of any NGO in Russia and tell him or her, look, from now on, you should stop your operations in the United States promoting particular set of values. But Donald Trump cannot pick the line and call George Soros and say, look, George, enough is enough. I order you to get out of Russia and to stop your open society activities there. So there is a profound asymmetry between the political systems, and that's why any attempt to agree on how we define sharp power and how we cope with sharp power are unfortunately not very successful. At least so far, they have not been successful.
So before we open it up to questions, I'm wondering if we can end on a note of recommendations. You've been pretty gloomy about the prospects of improved relations, but is there several things, 2 or 3 things that you might be able to recommend? Let's say we jettisoned you into the White House to be close advisor to our next president, and really wanted you to give us an honest and very analytical answer to what those suggestions might be. What is it that the United States could do or should be thinking about doing to improve relations? Or is it not up to us at this point?
Well, I think that I will sound very trivial, but it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily wrong. First of all, I think that it's important to restore lines of communication. I think it's really bad that our embassies today are like besieged fortresses. I cannot get visa to get to the United States because there were very serious cuts in the personnel of the consulate. And I'm sure that Americans have same problems. So the first thing that I would do would be to stop this diplomatic war and just to allow embassies, diplomats do what they can do and what they should do. And I recall, when Joe Huntsman and later on Ambassador Sullivan came to Moscow. I feel very sorry because they have so few people, and it's impossible to keep relations, especially if you have two big countries and they keep closing consulates. You cannot get a visa for Russia in the West Coast, in the Urals, or in St. Petersburg. It's a shame that there is no US consulate in St. Petersburg. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in my opinion, we should try to keep what we have, because though, of course, the relationship is not good, but there are some pockets of cooperation which we should try to preserve. For example, we worked successfully in the Arctic region, the Arctic Council. Russia and the United States have fewer problems between them than the United States and Canada. I know some people on this side and that side are working on that, and I think that that should be kept. There are, when we talk about Syria, even usually we approach Syria as an area where Russia and the United States oppose each other, but in terms of deconflicting, in terms of confidence building measures, Syria is not a bad example. We have a very saturated theater, but not a single incident between Russian aircraft and American aircraft. So it means that there are some ways to work together, at least on this small issue. And there are many issues like that. We can talk about space, we can talk about some select research, even trade, despite sanctions. There are pockets where trade is flourishing. So that would be my second suggestion. My third suggestion, which I guess is also trivial, is that we should do our best to keep this humanitarian, social, and I would also add, that's my bias, of course, also expert communication, because unfortunately I feel it, how this community of experts is being influenced by political correctness. I'm losing my partners in Washington, D.C. I don't want to name institutions, but it's sad to see what's going on. It is going on the Russian side, I think, more than on the US side. The issue of political correctness and this, I would say, theatrical anti-Americanism. I think that indeed the red line between research and propaganda is getting blurred, which is bad, but it happens on the US side as well. And I hope that here you could give us a lesson of impartial, bipartisan and objective research, not saturated with ideology or advocacy. So I think this is important. And finally, and I will end up with that, I think that indeed, there are issues which are so important that should be kept separate from other rather negative elements of the relationship. And strategic arms control is one of them. I think whatever happens in our relationship, arms control should not be a hostage to other problems between Moscow and Washington. Well, again, nothing new. I think that I would probably give more advice to my own government than to US government. Unfortunately, they seldom listen to me, but I think that we shouldn't lose hope. I think that in the end of the day, the two countries do not have irreconcilable contradictions. It's not the Soviet Union, the United States, and therefore I think we should keep trying.
Andrei, from your lips, thank you. This has been fantastically, typically Andrei Kartunov, totally thoughtful and nuanced, and you've given us a lot to think about. I know there are going to be a lot of questions out there, so I'm going to turn it to Arik Barakovsky, who's going to triage the questions for us.
Thank you so much, Liz. Well, first of all, I want to say that we are pleased to be a part of this important initiative by the Murrow Center to better understand how the United States is perceived abroad. And on behalf of the Russia and Eurasia program, we're delighted to support this event with Dr. Tarlow and Dr. Korchinov. I'd like to invite members of the audience, and some of you have already done so, to submit questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and I will take as many of them as we can. We have about half an hour. So the first question comes from Parv Agarwal, who's a recent Fletcher graduate. He asks, what are key areas for cooperation between the United States and Russia on common global challenges that are not standard matters in the bilateral relations, issues such as the global energy transition, poverty reduction, outer space exploration, global health? Are these issues that the United States and Russia can work on to improve relations and potentially to build on?
It's a good question. And I think that opportunities are in plenty. There are many issues which are not toxic, at least which should not be toxic, where we can work together. For example, Russia and the United States are two major exporters of food stock. And hunger is a big problem. Unfortunately, it's likely to be even bigger in years to come. I'm sure that the two countries can work together on food security on the global scale, but also on the regional level. You go to Africa, and I think that there are many ways in which Russia and the United States can work together to provide public goods for the African continent. And that might involve our more significant contribution to international peacekeeping operations, maybe under the umbrella of the United Nations. That might involve, for example, cooperation in public health. And I would even say maybe education, because both Russia and the United States have a lot of educational experience in Africa. You take Russia, about 500,000 of Africans got their education either in the Soviet Union or in the Russian Federation. And definitely this is an entry point that we should keep in mind. I would be happy to see a US-Russian cooperation on the anti-COVID vaccine, for example, or on other diseases. I'm not sure that it is doable right now, but my personal take is that in future, maybe not so remote future, the power of a nation will be defined to a large extent by the ability of the nation to contribute to public goods, global public goods. Unfortunately, neither Russia nor the United States is moving in this direction. I would say maybe on the contrary, but I see it as an opportunity. And I think that there are certain areas where Russia and the United States might complement each other. And finally, let me say that though I believe that the energy sector is very sensitive, politically loaded, but if you look at the trilateral Putin-Trump MBS deal on oil in March of this year, which allowed to stabilize, to some extent at least, global oil prices, I think it's a good example of how you can work together, even if you happen to compete with each other in a particular area.
Second question comes from Silva Kantarova, asking you to elaborate on the China factor in US-Russia relations. How do Russians perceive the worsening relationship between the United States and China and Trump's trade war? You've mentioned China to some extent already, but how is the relationship between the United States and Russia perceived today?
Well, I think that there are people in Moscow, maybe not only in Moscow, in other places who who are happy to see the deterioration of relations between Beijing and Washington, primarily because this deterioration might mean that Moscow becomes more important for China. China will need Russia more compared to a situation when we have a chimerical or G2 arrangement when China and the United States agree on everything and rule the world. So in this sense, if you take the tactical benefits, they might be there. Though, frankly, I don't see right now any softening of the Chinese approach to Russia because of the confrontation with the United States. However, my take is that strategically, this confrontation is not likely to benefit anyone, Russia included, because if we are moving in the direction of a rigid bipolar world, and unfortunately, I'm afraid we are moving in this direction right now, then all other nations will have to make choices. They will have to choose sides. And it's clear that Europe is likely to choose the United States to the detriment of its economic, technological, trade, and other relations with Beijing, and Russia will have to choose Beijing. But if Russia chooses Beijing, of course, that will be harmful, for example, for the relations between Russia and India, or Russia and Vietnam, Russia and other countries which are not very friendly to China. So I think that it's in our common interest to avoid this bipolarity to the extent we can. Not to mention, of course, that uncontrolled confrontation might lead the world to yet another recession with unclear but clearly negative consequences for all players, including the Russian Federation.
Great. Our next question comes from Edward Schumacher Matos on U.S. government media outlets. He asks whether the Voice of America and other American media have influence in Russia, and is it going up or down? And what do Russians think of U.S. government accusations that RT is an official propaganda tool used for manipulation in the United States?
Well, of course, Voice of America has its own audience. I think that the environment for its operations in Russia is deteriorating. And I can imagine that journalists working there are facing many difficulties. But I have to tell you that I give interviews to Voice of America, so I basically don't care. But I think that if you take the Russian governmental position, they look at Voice America as many in Washington look at RT. They think that Voice of America is an instrument of the US propaganda, that it does not reflect the real situation in Russia or in the world, that it is highly biased, and it is controlled by people who are negatively inclined towards Russia, as they say now here, it is controlled by Russophobes, by people who dislike not just the political system, but dislike Russia as a country, as a society, as a civilization, and so on.
And about RT, I guess the question really gets at the heart of the matter of misinformation and disinformation and its effect on U.S.-Russia relations. What do you see as the role of government-owned media in the relationship between the United States and Russia?
Well, it's hard to tell, because RT, take RT, it's a rather big outlet, and there are various people, different opinions and different levels of sophistication. I think that indeed one of the mandates of RT is to get the other side of story. So the assumption is that the US mainstream media is biased in its own way. There is a degree of self-censorship which does not allow outlets like the New York Times, for example, or CNN to cover specific issues or to present specific opinions. And basically RT is filling this vacuum by offering this other side of the picture. I think that this is the perception which is presented in Moscow. I would also say that one of the problems that I see here is that once you unleash the beast, it's very difficult to get it back into the cage. So I'm not sure that Putin personally, calls the RT director and tells her that they should do this and that. But I think that the environment which has emerged in this relationship definitely promotes, this very negative, critical, and biased approach to what's going in the United States. I think that there is certain logic in this trend. So, if I were to lead RT, I would definitely change the editorial policy. But of course, then the question would be how I could keep my audience, because RT might have some audience primarily because it is different. People watch RT not because they believe RT, they watch RT because they want to have a different view. And RT always comes with a different view. That's why it might have some audience in Europe or in the United States. But in my opinion, and I worked on that when I led an institution, civil society, we tried to educate journalists. We had a large program for younger journalists, especially journalists who worked on media issues. I still run a competition for young journalists who cover international relations. And I try to keep standards as high as possible. But of course, it's a drop in the bucket. It's what I can do, but it is not a solution to the problem. The solution of the problem should be a different political environment. And I think that Liz is right, that it would be easier, I would even say much easier, to turn around the Russian public opinion than to turn around the US-Russian opinion. Because I think that in our case, anti-Americanism is skin deep, and I'm not sure it's the case in the United States these days.
So we have another question from a Fletcher student, Erica Johnston, who is curious about the generational divide potentially in Russia, particularly with younger government officials and diplomats coming into the fold. Do you see them stepping into leadership and altering the mentality of the Russian elite and the government because of this generational divide, or are their anti-American views as entrenched as the older elites?
Well, I think that, it's a good question. Of course, I don't have a full answer to this question. But I think it's a mixed bag, because on the one hand, indeed, people who are better educated, who spend more time in internet, who are fluent in foreign languages, who have friends, acquaintances abroad, they should have a different view on the world, on the United States as well. And I think that they might be less indoctrinated, more resistant to views like the ones that come from RT. On the other hand, I would say that if you take the older generation, I think these people are or were to some extent, very romantic about the United States. They could have been positively inclined or negatively, but there was a special feeling. This very peculiar love-hate relationship. I'm not sure that it is still there with the younger generation. I think they are much more pragmatic, much more rational, sometimes more cynical. So for them, the United States is not an Easter bunny, neither it is a Tasmanian devil. It's just another country. They take a more rational approach to the United States. Maybe it's good, but whether they can change the political relationship is not clear. It's not clear. I hope that they can. I hope that they will have to do that, and it might be a matter of 5 or 10 years. Maybe we'll see a major shift in the political establishment already in 24, 25. Maybe it will take more time. Maybe it's 2030. But definitely the relationship will be affected by these more pragmatic, more rational, less romantic attitudes towards the United States.
We have a question from Fletcher Professor Emeritus Alan Henriksen, who also happened to attend the seminar in Hokkaido in 1985. He asks, how do Russians view Americans' alliances, such as with Japan, NATO, and others? Are these considered to be, as during the Cold War, partnerships for containment of Russia, or is there a different impression of these security and other relationships today?
Well, first of all, I think that in Russia, well, not all of us, but many of us do not believe in multilateralism. If you take NATO, for example, many would say that the NATO alliance exists because of the US hegemony. So if you want to discuss real issues with real people, you should go to Brussels, you should go to Washington. This is the place where major decisions are made. And European countries are not completely sovereign. They're not completely independent. And it means that you will waste your time by dealing with Europeans if you don't deal with Americans. Likewise, if you take Asia, I think that one of the common views, and I think I can call it semi-official view, is that the Russian-Japanese rapprochement and even reconciliation didn't happen primarily because of the US position. That the United States didn't want to see Japan getting too close to Russia, and though both countries were on the way to resolving the territorial dispute, but Japanese didn't get a nod from Washington, so they have to retreat and to reconsider. I don't agree with this view. I think that in case of Japan, most of responsibility is on our side. But anyway, this is the perception. And on the other hand, what I should say, they wouldn't probably confess it publicly. But one of the questions for Russia, would the world be safer without NATO than it is with NATO? For example, NATO, led by the United States in Afghanistan, would Afghanistan be a safer place and a safer neighbor for Central Asian countries if NATO were not there? The answer is probably no. Probably without NATO, Afghanistan will drop into the hands of talibs, and we might have seen a negative spillover effect on Central Asian countries and on Russia itself. So the rhetoric is that, of course, NATO is bad. NATO is an aggressive alliance. NATO invaded in Yugoslavia. NATO destroyed Libya. So there are, I don't want to get into these details, but of course there are many grievances about the NATO behavior. But at the same time, my feeling is that at the expert level, they consider NATO to be a kind of straitjacket. It's an institution that might somehow contain most radical, most inappropriate hegemonic aspirations of the United States. Without NATO, the United States could have become a loose cannon, because NATO has its own decision-making process. It is an institution that operates on the consensus basis. But the real problem for Russia is a potential threat of the NATO enlargement in the eastern direction. I think this is something that they talk about when NATO is mentioned.
So we have another audience question about nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia. What prospects do you see for the renewal of the New START agreement? And what are your predictions if it were to expire? What might strategic stability look like without a formalized arms control system?
Well, I hope that the New START agreement can be extended. I think that there are still chances, not very high chances, that they will extend it for at least 1 year, and then they might extend it further, depending on the outcome of the US presidential elections. But it will not save the old arms control model. I think the old arms control model is coming to an end. And we will have to reinvent it. Maybe we should even change the name. Maybe it shouldn't be arms control, it should be arms management or something else. But first of all, and they talk about that a lot, we have to multilateralize it. It will be very painful, very difficult, very protected process, even if there is goodwill on all the sides, because nobody really knows what multilateral deterrence means. We're moving from the arithmetic to algebra. It's a different ballgame. Second, it is also clear that a new model should emphasize not numbers, but technological advances. It will not be about warheads or delivery systems, because neither Russia nor the United States is likely to start a new arms race in numbers. But it will be about space, it will be about cyber, it will be about autonomous lethal weapons, it will be about artificial intelligence, it will be about prompt strike again. So again, nobody really knows how to control technologies, how to move away from quantity to quality in arms control. And I would also add that, in my opinion, it is very difficult to imagine that we will have traditional thick volumes of legally binding, very specific arms control agreements. Arms control in its traditional form, in my humble opinion, cannot catch up with technologies. So we should think about different formats, and we should consider different ways of making sure that arms control agreements will not be violated, that there'll be no cheating. And again, we are just in the very beginning of this process. So my take is that even if we start now, we'll have to cross what I would call a kind of death alley, a couple of years, maybe 10 years, of a very volatile situation. So I think until we get to the new model of arms control, we should think not about disarmament, but rather about how to preserve peace. And that means more mill-to-mill, more red lines, more exchange of information on nuclear doctrines, maybe de-alerting, something that can keep us safe till we reach our destination, which will be an entirely different model of arms control, which will reflect realities of the 21st century. Again, it's a big question. I can talk for hours about that. Let me stop here.
Thank you. And so I think we have time for one more question before we try to sum up the discussion. This question is on the accusations of Trump's campaign in the 2016 election colluding with Russia, or Russia having a compromise on Trump. There's been a lot of discussion about this in the media, but in general, how did Russians see the Mueller investigation, the accusations of Russia's collusion with the Trump campaign?
Well, I think that the standard reaction would be that Russia became a hostage to the domestic political struggle in the United States, that Democrats who lost elections in 2016, instead of trying to analyze the reasons for their failure, and instead of trying to reinvent the Democratic Party, preferred to look for scapegoats, and they found the scapegoat in Russia, and that was a way to avoid serious discussions on changes in the Democratic Party. And of course, the perception is that basically Trump, who is labeled by Biden as a Putin's puppy, didn't make the relationship any better. If you take the relationship today and 4 years ago, Trump almost destroyed the symmetry, which was the core mechanism of interaction between Russia and the United States. We had just one summit, which was not a splashing success, to put it mildly. Trump destroyed or almost destroyed arms control, and Trump basically replaced diplomacy with economic sanctions. So if Trump is a puppy of Mr. Putin, definitely Putin didn't train his puppy well enough, because the relationship got much worse than it was. That's why expectations, as I said, expectations now are low. And though I think that many Russians would think that Trump is funnier than Biden. He has more wit, and he's flamboyant, and he is fun to watch. But I'm not sure that there are expectations that if Trump is reelected, he will be able to turn the relationship around and to start a new reset.
Thank you so much, Andrei. Liz, I will turn it over to you for some concluding remarks.
So what I thought was really most revealing is the nuances that you gave us on every topic that you were asked about. It's not totally intuitive, the ways in which you are seeing although we have a set of relationships that's not likely to reset, there are areas that we actually can work together. I was really optimistic when you summed it up at the end, talking about, as you say, maybe they're trivial, but they're concrete. And oftentimes that's what really leads to improvement of relations. I venture to say both sides would like to avoid conflict. And with that in mind, I think there are areas, if we are open to working on small, specific, and concrete initiatives, perhaps we can make some progress or at least maintain that balance. And I think this has been enormously revealing. I see some of the other questions that people weren't able to get across, but I can see from the interest that there's just enormous appetite for finding ways to improve the relationship, and hopefully the rhetoric can be softened, and we can actually go ahead and do some concrete work ahead. So I'll stop there because I want to turn it back over to Edward, who I think has a few summary comments, unless of course, Andre, you have anything you'd like to say as a final benediction yourself.
Well, let me just limit myself to saying that I'm sorry that I failed to respond to all the questions, and I see some of them in the chat. Let me also say that I'm very glad to see some old friends here, especially old friends, really those who were with us in Japan. And let me also say that I hope that and that would conclude my view on the United States. I hope that the United States will overcome its current political crisis. And it's a self-serving expectation, because I do believe that only a strong US president with full backing at home, a president who is able to consolidate the United States around his program, can fix relations with Moscow. And I think that this is indispensable. This person can be tough on Russia. This person can be tough on Putin. But I think not just you in the United States, but we outside of the United States also need a strong US president and a stronger United States, because the United States remains indispensable for solving very many international problems. So we wish you well.
That was a great benediction. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Edward.
Well, Andre and Liz, thank you so much for what was really a wonderful discussion and a wonderful way to end it, Andre. I think we need Russia just as much as you feel you need the United States to help solve all these various global issues. And let's hope that we can work together. So to the audience, I want to thank you very much. And please stay tuned for future sessions. And with that, I'll bring it to an end. Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, Andre. Be well.